Nvidia successfully delayed the reviews of their 8GB RTX 5060 Ti, but they couldn't hide them forever. After about a week's delay, I can finally show you just how bad this product is. And if you missed it, last week Nvidia released the RTX 5060 Ti, available in either an 8 or 16GB configuration. And leading up to the reviews, we learned that Nvidia was actually actively delaying the 8GB models, meaning it wouldn't be featured in any reviews, but it would be available for purchase when the reviews went live or very shortly thereafter, and that indeed turned out to be the case. I snapped up the Asus Prime model for 720 Australian dollars, which is currently the most affordable RTX 5060 Ti we have in stock, and then with the most affordable 16GB model being the MSI Ventus 2X for $880, and that's a 22% premium if you want the 16GB model. And the problem is, both the 16 and 8GB versions share the exact same name, RTX 5060 Ti. And while the GPU configuration is identical, the difference in memory capacity does make them two very different products. 8GB of VRAM in 2025 for a GPU as fast as the RTX 5060 Ti, which admittedly it's not an impressively fast product for the money, but it is still too fast for such a limited memory buffer. There's countless real-world scenarios that will see performance of the RTX 5060 Ti severely limited or even crippled by the 8GB frame buffer, and of course we're going to explore a few of those today. The problem with a product like the RTX 5060 Ti is that many people are going to purchase it based on the performance and capabilities of the 16GB model. They're then going to buy the cheapest version they can, and that'll almost always result in the purchase of an 8GB model, a product that is arguably already obsolete. Now, just to be very clear here, 8GB of VRAM is still sufficient for the vast majority of games out there, and if you happen to play a lot of esports titles, then VRAM capacity is not really a big deal, certainly not a concern. And even then, in many of examples where the memory buffer is insufficient, you can tweak the quality settings for a highly playable experience. But it's not necessarily sufficient for an optimal experience in many of the latest games, and this is a situation that is only going to get worse over the next few years, significantly worse in fact. Most people buying a GeForce 50 series graphics card right now, especially a model like the RTX 5060 Ti, will likely keep it for the next 3 years, probably longer, and I hate to think just how bad 8GB graphics cards are going to fare in the next 3 years. It'll probably be a very similar situation to what you see with 4GB graphics cards today. Not only that, but when spending over $400 US, do you really want to be worried about your VRAM amount? Constantly having to tweak quality settings in the hope that you're keeping things within that memory buffer. That's a seriously compromised and unfortunate experience to endure when spending so much money. The 8GB model is meant to have an MSRP of $380 US, but right now, the cheapest listing over at Newegg is $420 US, and most models are more like $440 US or more. Meanwhile, the 16GB models start at $430 US, though most are priced at or above $480. Still, you're talking about at most a 14% premium for the 16GB model. And this makes the 8GB version a serious trap for those unaware that there's two versions of the same product. And the point being here is that there should have never been an 8GB version of the RTX 5060 Ti to begin with, and Nvidia knows this. They know this is a bad product. They know 8GB of VRAM in 2025 is woefully inadequate, and they know most of you know this. But they also know they'll make a lot of money, as most gamers aren't as tech savvy as you lot, and they'll just buy the cheapest model available. And they also know they can take advantage of the pre-built market. By selling those people a product that's already obsolete, they'll be coming back much sooner than they would have otherwise, looking to buy a new GPU, affording Nvidia the ability to sell them a new product next generation, or probably even mid-generation with a product refresh. And we've been saying it for years now, this is planned obsolescence. And if you can't see it now, well, you're probably Nvidia's favorite type of customer. But in an effort to show you just how bad an 8GB RTX 5060 Ti is in 2025, I bought one and spent days collecting hours of side-by-side testing footage, which I can hopefully condense down into a much shorter video, so let's get to it. For all of this testing, I'm using a PCIe 5.0 enabled AM5 test system with a 9800X3D and 32GB of DDR5 6000 CL30 memory, so this is pretty much a best case scenario when running over the VRAM buffer with an RTX 5060 Ti. The results on a PCIe 4.0 system will be worse, and they'll be worlds worse for a PCIe 3.0 system. So, let's get into the results. We'll start with The Last of Us Part 2 and at 4K no less. You might think 4K is a silly resolution for such a product, but I disagree for a few reasons. Firstly, the RTX 5060 Ti is powerful enough for 4K gaming, especially with upscaling, like what we're using here with DLSS quality. And secondly, high quality 4K high refresh rate monitors now cost less than an RTX 5060 Ti, and they enable a truly breathtaking experience. But the key takeaway here being that the 16GB card was able to deliver 68 FPS, whereas 8GB is limited to just over 30 FPS with regular frame time spikes. By the end of our test, we were looking at 120% better 1% low performance for the 16GB model. That's a pretty insane difference, but I'm confident some will attempt to dismiss this testing, so let's try again at 1440p. As you'd expect, things do improve at 1440p for the 8GB model, but even so, we're still running into periods of horrible frame time performance, and frame rates in general are around 30% higher for the 16GB card. Now, the 16GB model is clocking its cores around 1% higher. We're using the Asus Prime for both the 8GB and 16GB cards. So this is just how they're clocking out of the box. And obviously a 1% clock frequency discrepancy can't account for the massive difference in performance that we're seeing here. And by the end of our test, the 16GB card was 34% faster on average and 215% faster when comparing the 1% lows. Now, a selling point of the GeForce 40 and 50 series has been frame generation, at least according to Nvidia's marketing. And if we enable this feature, the additional VRAM requirements hurt the 8GB model, dropping 1% lows to single digits for a truly awful experience. Okay, but what if we drop down to the high preset at 1440p with DLSS upscaling enabled? Here we encounter rare frame time stutters for the 8GB model, but overall performance is quite good, though it is still much slower than the 16GB card, which by the end of our test was 18% faster when comparing the average frame rate and 35% faster for the 1% lows. So even when using these more mild quality settings, the 8GB card still lags behind. And that being the case, I tried the medium preset, and here the frame time performance was cleaned up, and now the 8GB model isn't too much slower. Still, having said that, they're not at parity, with the 16GB model offering 12% greater average frame rates and 11% better 1% lows. Even with the low quality preset at 1440p with DLSS quality upscaling, the 16GB model was 8% faster on average, so not a huge margin there, but I was still surprised to find a small performance advantage in favour of the 16GB model using the low quality preset. And somehow here we're still right on the limits for the 8GB card. Then at native 1080p, with the very high preset, the game wants over 9GB of VRAM, so the 8GB card is back to struggling away with terrible frame time performance. And again, this is at 1080p. As a result, the 16GB model provided 25% greater average frame rate performance and 320% better 1% lows. So that's really bad. So let's move on to another game. Here we have Final Fantasy XIV at native 1080p using the ultra quality preset. And while very playable on the 8GB model, performance was improved by 14% with the 16GB version, but also 1080p is a very low resolution, and you probably shouldn't be buying a 1080p monitor in 2025, so let's jump up to 1440p. At native 1440p, the 16GB model ends up 58% faster on average, with 218% better 1% lows. And while I wouldn't personally play this game at around 50 FPS, I know some of you who prioritize visuals over frame rates would. But let's enable upscaling for what I deem a much more optimal configuration, and this sees the 16GB version average 74 FPS, making it 80% faster than the 8GB model, which produced an average of just 41 FPS. Now, out of interest, I enabled the frame generation feature, which did seem to help the 8GB card, but even so, by the end of our test, the 16GB model was reported to be 24% faster for the average frame rate and 30% faster for the 1% lows. And despite the frame rates for the 8GB model looking reasonably good, the game did feel noticeably worse. Finally, playing at native 1440p with the high preset allowed the 8GB card to roughly match the 16GB version, coming in just a few percent slower. Now, getting the 8GB RTX 5060 Ti to play Indiana Jones and the Great Circle wasn't that easy, as only the low and medium settings worked. And even then we couldn't test at 4K with DLSS enabled using the medium preset, as the game would immediately crash to desktop. So at native 1080p, using the medium preset, the 8GB card averaged 114 FPS, and this meant the 16GB version was still 7% faster, but overall, the 8GB card did work well enough here. But if we go to 1440p, the 8GB model starts to struggle, and while it maintains decent frame time consistency, the 1% lows were 90% greater for the 16GB model, while the average frame rate was improved by 82%. So in this example, the 16GB card was very usable under these conditions. The 16GB model was also highly playable at 1080p using the Ultra preset, and even at 1440p with upscaling it did work well. Again, anything above medium and the 8GB model crashes to desktop, so we really are talking about a night and day difference between these two memory configurations for the same GPU. Playing Hogwarts Legacy at native 1440p with the Ultra preset saw similar performance on both models, though the 8GB card did suffer some texture popping issues, which we've documented in the past with the 8GB RTX 4060 Ti. The performance-related issues for the 8GB card began when enabling ray tracing. Using the high preset with high RT at 1440p, saw the 16GB model deliver 62% greater average frame rate performance, with an insane 483% increase to the 1% lows. Basically, the 8GB card was a broken, stuttery mess under these conditions. Therefore, I tried the medium preset with medium ray tracing, and here the 8GB model still suffered frequent frame time issues and overall poor 1% low performance, which saw the 16GB card up to 96% faster. Next up, we have Horizon Forbidden West at 4K, using the DLSS performance mode with the very high quality preset, and these settings didn't work at all on the 8GB card. The game was completely unplayable with 1% lows of 9 FPS. The 16GB model, on the other hand, was good for over 60 FPS when looking at the 1% lows, and managed to average 72 FPS in our test, making it 350% faster for the average frame rate, and 589% faster when comparing the 1% lows. So let's try 1440p with DLSS quality. Here the 8GB model was better, but still not good, and still not playable with 1% lows of just 18 FPS. And this meant the 16GB model was even faster than what we saw at 4K, averaging almost 100 FPS, making it 234% faster, or 344% faster when we look at those 1% lows. So what about 1080p native with the very high preset? These settings were playable on the 8GB model, though frame time performance wasn't great. The 16GB model, on the other hand, ran like a dream with 100 FPS on average and 1% lows of over 80 FPS, making it almost 80% faster on average with 131% greater 1% lows. Now, 1440p with DLSS quality enabled using the high preset, so not the highest quality preset, we still found that the 16GB model ran much better. Now, please note, I messed up the scaling size for the overall statistics in Riva Tuner, as I did have to come back and retest the 16GB model to try and get the test results done at the same time of day. But please note, both GPUs were tested under the exact same conditions, both are at 1440p with DLSS quality enabled. Under these conditions, the 16GB model was 148% faster for the average frame rate and 193% faster for the 1% lows. The 8GB model also struggled with frame pacing, often resulting in a very jittery experience. Now at 1440p, still using DLSS quality, but this time with the medium preset, we finally find settings where the 8GB model works. Not super well, but it does mostly work. There was still the occasional frame time issue, and this did see the 16GB model produce 47% greater 1% lows. Space Marine 2 provides an interesting look at the 8GB versus 16GB comparison, and a key reminder for why benchmark graphs aren't always the best way to test this stuff. Using the Ultra preset with the 4K texture pack enabled, at 4K with DLSS quality upscaling, we're looking at comfortably over 60 FPS for both GPUs. Though quite oddly, you might have noticed that the 8GB card is actually a little bit faster here, and there is a reason for that, and that reason is it's not fully rendering the game. Here's a look at some static shots of how the game looks. Now quite easily you can see just how bad the 8GB presentation is, and then how good the 16GB model looks. I don't really need to point out the differences here, it should be plain to see, and as awful as the muddy low resolution textures are, they're actually made worse by the constant pop-ins as the game tries its very best to fit in the higher resolution textures, but just ends up in a flickery mess. Under these conditions, very few textures are rendered correctly on the 8GB card, whereas the game looks amazing with 16GB and plays very well. And we've seen plenty of other examples where the frame rate performance appears fine for cards without enough VRAM, and in fact is, but the presentation is awful. Halo Infinite and Forspoken are two other games that come to mind. Moving on to A Plague Tale Requiem, for this test we're again at 4K with DLSS quality upscaling with the Ultra preset, and while the 16GB model isn't amazing here, we did see on average 52 FPS, making it 33% faster than the 8GB model with a 51% increase to those 1% lows. More realistic settings though would be to use DLSS performance at 4K. Here the 16GB model averaged over 60 FPS, though so too did the 8GB model, but the 16GB card did improve the 1% lows by 23%. Now for over 80 FPS, you can enable the ray tracing setting at 4K with DLSS performance, but with the high preset. Here the 16GB card averaged 86 FPS in our test with 1% lows of 72 FPS, so very good performance there, and that made it much faster than the 8GB card, which was unable to deliver playable performance, and it actually ended up crashing under these conditions. I tried multiple times, it would end up stuttering badly, which eventually led to crashing. Presumably the VRAM buffer was overwhelmed to the degree that the game just wasn't able to deal with it, at least in the way it's designed, and that caused a hard crash to desktop. Next up we have Assassin's Creed Shadows, which we're testing at 1440p with DLSS balanced upscaling enabled, using the very high preset, and here the 8GB model did suffer poor frame time performance. As a result, the 16GB model was 52% faster when looking at the 1% lows, and 50% faster for the average frame rate. More crucially, the game was enjoyable at 66 FPS on average, and not so much at 44 FPS using the 8GB card with those terrible frame time issues. Enabling frame generation didn't solve the poor frame time performance for the 8GB model, and in fact the 16GB model is now 62% faster when comparing the average frame rate performance. Now for testing Cyberpunk 2077, we're at 1440p with DLSS quality using the Ray Tracing Medium preset, and this completely killed the 8GB card. And of course this is an RTX based product, so I'm really not sure what kind of ray tracing you're doing with an 8GB graphics card. The 16GB model managed to average 54 FPS here, a 26% improvement over the 8GB model, but of course it was the 1% lows that were the big problem. Here the 16GB model was 73% faster. So again, frame time performance was very poor for the 8GB model. For those of you that want to enjoy some level of ray tracing at 4K, using the DLSS performance mode, even with the ray tracing low preset, the 8GB card is completely broken with just 29 FPS on average and 1% lows of 16 FPS, making the 16GB model up to 206% faster. A quick look at Marvel Rivals at 4K with DLSS performance enabled, along with the Ultra preset, saw the 16GB model average 69 FPS with 1% lows of 53 FPS, so certainly playable, though not what I'd call ideal for a multiplayer shooter. Still, when compared to the 8GB model, the average frame rate was 30% higher, with an 89% boost to the 1% lows. Moving on to Spider-Man 2, we'll start with the 4K results using DLSS performance mode with the very high preset. This simply didn't work with the 8GB model. The game was basically broken with terrible frame time performance and an average of less than 20 FPS. In contrast, the 16GB model averaged over 60 FPS with a 533% improvement to the 1% lows. So needless to say, the 16GB model was much better. Lowering the resolution to 1440p with DLSS quality, we find that the 8GB model is still completely broken. There's no chance anyone will find this playable, whereas the 16GB model averaged over 80 FPS with 1% lows of 47 FPS, allowing for a smooth, enjoyable gaming experience. Now for this next test, we're still at 1440p with quality DLSS, but I've downgraded from the very high preset to the high preset. But even here, the 8GB model still proves to be woefully insufficient, while the 16GB model averaged over 90 FPS, a 221% increase for the average frame rate and 358% for the 1% lows. Now, in an effort to achieve playable performance with the 8GB model, I dropped down to the native 1080p resolution, as upscaling isn't great at 1080p, so we opted for native. And when using the very high preset, the 8GB model is still terrible, averaging just 49 FPS, making the 16GB version almost 60% faster with an impressive 78 FPS on average. So now we've dropped down to the high preset at 1080p, and even here, the 8GB model was still very poor, delivering awful frame time performance and weak performance overall. As a result, the 16GB model was 35% faster when comparing the average frame rate and a massive 58% faster for the 1% lows. So again, just 8GB of VRAM is a terrible option in Spider-Man 2. Moving on to Star Wars Jedi Survivor, I haven't even bothered turning on ray tracing for this one. At 4K using DLSS performance mode with the Epic preset, the 16GB model delivered a satisfactory 68 FPS, whereas the 8GB model was limited to just 32 FPS on average. And that means the 16GB model was 113% faster for the average frame rate and 104% faster for the 1% lows. But more than that, the 16GB model actually rendered the game correctly, whereas the 8GB model featured a number of missing textures and artifacts. Now, a game where the 8GB model worked fine was Alan Wake 2. Here we saw very similar performance between both versions of the RTX 5060 Ti, and of course, as I noted at the start of this video, this is what you can expect to see in most games. God of War Ragnarok is another example where 8GB of VRAM was mostly fine. There was a small performance hit here and there at 4K using DLSS performance mode with the Ultra preset, but you can generally get away with 8GB of VRAM, though that is in our test. This might differ in other areas of the game or after extended periods of gameplay. Then we have Black Myth Wukong, which was also mostly okay with 8GB, though we did see slightly better performance with 16GB. And again, this might change in other sections of the game or after a more extended period of gameplay, but the point is, even in these examples, we're right on the edge of the 8GB buffer. So there you have it. We just looked at 15 different games, each with numerous examples where the 8GB version of the RTX 5060 Ti is clearly held back by its memory buffer, and that's evident by the fact that under the same conditions, the 16GB model was perfectly usable. It's painfully obvious now that an 8GB frame buffer is no longer satisfactory beyond really the most entry-level products, which they can't cost more than $150 US. And since those products no longer exist, neither should 8GB VRAM capacities, especially for discrete GPUs. Realistically, the minimum here should be 12GB, but in reality, moving forward, for an experience that is never compromised due to VRAM, you really want 16GB. And I'm confident within the realistic lifespan of these products, that will be proven to be the case, beyond a shadow of a doubt. That being the case, don't let people gaslight you into thinking the RTX 5060 Ti can't or shouldn't be used for 4K gaming. As we just saw, with enough VRAM, it absolutely can be, and 1440p with upscaling should very much be a thing a $400 US GPU can do. And again, with enough VRAM, this is certainly the case for the RTX 5060 Ti. I've seen a number of people argue that the RTX 5060 Ti is designed or even intended for 1080p gaming, and this is complete nonsense and a terrible argument for any consumer to be making. Again, as proven here, the RTX 5060 Ti is very capable at 1440p and 4K with upscaling enabled. The key ingredient here being that 16GB VRAM buffer. In my opinion, this one's very simple. If buying a new graphics card in 2025 and spending around $300 US, it needs to have a minimum of 12GB of VRAM. $400, you're looking at a minimum of 16GB, and then obviously anything more expensive than that does need to have a minimum of 16, but Realistically, products like an RTX 5080, for example, they should have at least 24 gigabytes of VRAM, especially with next generation consoles arriving within the realistic lifespan of that product. It's probably going to be an RTX 3080 10GB situation all over again, just at a considerably higher price point. Again, this works out really well for Nvidia. Super convenient. As I said, it's their planned obsolescence strategy, which means RTX 5080 owners will have to upgrade much sooner than they really should need to. As for the RTX 5060 Ti, my issues with this product are largely based on the fact that the RTX 5060 Ti 8GB and 16GB share the same name. Realistically, there needs to be just one memory configuration here, given how devastating the effects are on performance when buying the wrong model. So we should have one RTX 5060 Ti version with 16GB of VRAM, and then a non-Ti model, probably with 12GB of VRAM, or ideally 16GB. There's really no room or even justification for an 8GB model in the RTX 5060 series. Something else worth keeping in mind is the resale value of these things. As far as we can tell, based on the sold eBay listings, the 16GB version of the RTX 4060 Ti is fetching on average 42% more than the 8GB version. And that's despite the fact that the new 16GB models never cost more than 25% more. So I think you can expect that situation to become increasingly worse for the RTX 5060 Ti. These 8GB models are going to be worthless in comparison in about 2 years from now. Anyway, in conclusion, the 8GB version of the RTX 5060 Ti is the worst trap that we've seen for mainstream gamers. Probably ever. Nvidia really has outdone themselves on this one. Their obvious attempts to minimize reviews exposing this product so that they can take advantage of gamers is disgusting. And they plan to do the exact same thing with the upcoming RTX 5060, but of course we'll race out and buy one of those as soon as we can. The 8GB RTX 5060 Ti is just another point towards the GeForce 50 series being Nvidia's worst ever. And it's made it all the more frustrating due to the fact that it just didn't have to be this way. For now though, I am done with the 8GB RTX 5060 Ti, and I hope all gamers are. But at least on the bright side, I guess Nvidia has provided us with some pretty great tools for investigating VRAM usage now and in the future. I said the same thing with the GeForce 40 series. I can't believe in 2025 we're seeing a repeat of this configuration, but there you go. What more can you say? Anyway, don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed it. Subscribe for more content. As I said, we will be getting that RTX 5060 as soon as we can, and we'll be looking at AMD's answer to this stuff. Hopefully AMD has paid attention here and we don't see any overpriced 8GB cards from them. That'd be great to see, but we'll wait and see. I'm not going to hold my breath on that one. Other than that, we have the join button, Patreon if you want to become a member. You get access to our exclusive Discord server, monthly live streams, behind the scenes content, and Q&A stuff. So check that out if you're interested, but if not, it's perfectly fine. And I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.